Of Skeptic Sunday. We're super excited to have you here with us today. Everything's up, everything's up and running correctly for this live stream, and then we'll hop right in, and then we'll be hopping right into it. So, with today's stream, we're going to be focusing on The Alchemy of Finance by Geroge Soros. For those of you not familiar with Geroge Soros, he is one of the most famous investors of modern times, most famous for breaking the Bank of England. The Bank of England was broken by Soros when he bet against the pound and made $1 billion in one day. This is considered to be his most successful speculation ever, and one of the major reasons he's given a lot of weight or credence in money management circles. Soros outlined his approach to investment in the book The Alchemy of Finance, which is going to form the basis of most of today's stream. In this book, Soros ran a 2-year live experiment where he went over different investments and the different theories he had. Soros's ideas around investing are extremely interesting, but one of the major attractions I had to doing a stream on Geroge Soros, really focusing in on his ideas, is the relationship he has with Karl Popper. For those of you who are not familiar with Karl Popper, his work was extremely influential in developing the idea of the unity of science. He was a noted critic of Marxism. His book, The Poverty of Historicism, is one that I highly recommend you take a look at. Excellent, excellent work that critiques the ideas of Marx. But this idea of the unity of sciences is extremely intriguing because it leads to false ideas of perception. So generally, there's this idea that science, because of its empirical nature, provides us with some degree of certainty. This certainty has been critiqued and rebuffed in both the natural and social sciences, this idea that there is a definitive truth. In The Alchemy of Finance, Soros points this out with the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, which is basically the idea in quantum physics that quanta actually have any determinate state. They're actually quite random, and there's no predictable motion. Particles just seem to pop and go all over the place without any determined pattern. So this idea that we see in Marx, as well as we see in most charting and graph ideas, that you can predict the market or that the market tends towards a predictable series of phenomena, is really quite flawed. So people spend a lot of time looking into the future, trying to understand what the future will be. And those judgments are not necessarily going to pan out, since the future is fundamentally unpredictable and it's uncertain. So where we're going to be going with today, and we're going to be developing some themes. So I'm going to be listening and reacting to an interview Geroge Soros did earlier in his investment career, at the time the book Soros on Soros came out during the 1990s, which was a subsequent publication to The Alchemy of Finance. And we're going to be diving into that a little bit more. I'm going to start today's stream focused on the concept of market fundamentalism and the critique that Geroge Soros offers us of the market and how the market acts, based on his principle of reflexivity. So personally, this idea of reflexivity is big within the work of Soros. He's based his entire approach to investing on the idea of reflexivity, which is essentially the idea that perceptions have a basis or they impact reality. For example, in a rising housing market, the supposition that, houses are going to keep rising in price like we've seen over the past 24 months, that supposition or that idea, that real estate's going to keep going up and up and up, essentially becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that is detached from the actual fundamentals of the real estate. So this idea that somehow markets are perfectly priced on fundamentals, or really take all the fundamentals into consideration of price, is highly critiqued by Soros, and this insight is what allows speculators to then operate. So, a lot of modern financial theory in the United States, a lot of ideas. You have two major phenomenon, which that Soros will criticize. I meant to say that we'll be going into a little bit of Marx as well. These two phenomena are market fundamentalism and then socialist fundamentalism, as I would describe it. So the idea that markets tend towards equilibrium is highly criticized by George Soros in his work. I just want to briefly go to a powerful quote that I like on page 33, just to outline this concept of market fundamentalism as we dive into this a little bit more. So, market fundamentalism is a false and dangerous ideology. It is false on at least two counts. First, it profoundly misapprehends the way financial markets operate. It assumes that markets tend towards an equilibrium that assures optimum allocation of resources. So this idea is extremely important, since when you hear a lot of policymakers in the United States, there's this constant idea that we need to find market-based solutions, or that markets tend towards a natural equilibrium or distribution of resources. This goes on to introduce the second flaw, which Soros will then lead into, which is the idea that markets are somehow moral actors. And what I mean by moral actors here is, somehow an investor obtains a moral quality. So let me finish this quote, and then I want to segue to just a brief mention of the Pareto Principle, which I think is important here. So it assumes that markets tend towards an equilibrium that assures optimum allocation of resources. Second, by equating private interest with the public interest, market fundamentalism endows the pursuit of self-interest with a moral quality. The second fallacy is even more dangerous than the first one. It accounts for the widespread abuses that characterize the recent bust as compared to the earlier one. It can be seen that the boom-bust model has withstood the test of time. The fact that people have been surprised by what happened indicates that the model, far from belaboring the obvious, still has some explanatory power. So, the fact that the pursuit of success has taken precedence over moral considerations is a source of instability. I have explored this subject in greater depth in my book, Open Society Reforming Global Capitalism. So Soros does offer fundamentally here a scholar's critique of the phenomenon of market fundamentalism, but there's two errors here in society that I think it's important to realize. And these are themes you're going to see continually harped on in my stream or even my own thinking ever since I read The Alchemy of Finance about, nearly 8 years ago at this point. Soros's points on market fundamentalism have stayed with me, and these are important characteristics of how I approach thinking, since having grown up with Hayek, Popper is not a far jump on your philosophical reading, or even with Ludwig von Mises. And even when you're taking into account the work of Peter F. Drucker, he and Soros are not very far apart in terms of their thinking. But this idea that markets tend towards equilibrium seems fairly flawed. Markets are prone to abuse and do require substantial regulation in order to work fairly. Even noted capitalists like J.D. Rockefeller, who I did a previous live stream on, but I took down, unfortunately, were focused on the idea of, this boom bust cycle is extremely dangerous, and this market instability of boom and bust doesn't create any lasting value. So when you're looking to profit from the market, Soros's basic idea of reflexivity is, herd stupidity creates a feedback loop, and when you time things correctly, either through short or long positions, you can run an experiment very quickly that's going to allow you to derive a profit. So this profit itself is fairly easy to obtain with Soros in mind. But with the moral aspect, I do kind of want to harp on this because, with Marxism, even market fundamentalism, there does end up being an extremely moral dimension to these arguments. We end up arriving at the idea what's going on here and why are these people good? So someone who I think has gotten sort of a moral white coat despite being reprehensible human beings, somebody like Jeff Bezos or even Elon Musk. I think Musk is probably a good example of this idea that market success is somehow moral because the market is the optimal system to determine things. A market in and of itself is completely amoral. There's nothing good or bad about a market. It's just simply distributing things. A market in and of itself is a highly Darwinian mechanism where it presupposes, survival of the fittest. Where if we're designing a system, I don't think we would go with the Darwinian one since it seems a bit amoral, where people are cast about and when they're old, they die because they're weak. It's quite a grim and daunting world to live in. And again, if you look at Thomas Hobbes and Leviathan, the natural state of man is short, brutish, and brief. Why would you want to live like that? But where I'm going here is, these companies, because they're successful, Jack Welch is a good example where he created a financial system at General Electric Company, which was essentially all Fugazi. It was all bullshit. And that was something that really underpinned a lot of Soros's work. It's just, again, because you could see it with Merger Mania, where essentially these estate conglomerates began to operate financially. I don't want to go too much into the weeds here of this book, but again, highly, highly recommend. But the point I want to make here before moving on is you see this idea of market fundamentalism manifest itself in twisting the Pareto optimality, which is something that impacts a lot of society, surprisingly, even though there's really not a lot of empirical evidence to support it from the social sciences. This idea that 20% of people will drive 80% of the success, or that only outcomes are derived by a very small sliver of people. This kind of takes the great man of history or the Ubermach and really muddies it up. So by that logic, though, only 20% of companies generate 80% of the profits. So you should really only invest in those 20%, within the market instead of investing in the entire distribution. But that makes something a little interesting. But this this Pareto distribution fallacy tends to create the idea that somehow these billionaires are somehow the elect, or somehow they're the elite, by twisting kind of an interesting economic idea. I do need to probably just dedicate a stream to the Pareto Principle and how that gets twisted in terms of invention, and some of the toxic feedback loops that creates. But I do subscribe to the idea that George Soros has had of fostering open societies. A lot of his work that we're seeing the benefit of now in Ukraine has really built out democratic societies, or more democratic and open societies, in a lot of Eastern Europe. So some of that work that's gone on behind the scenes towards the integration of Eastern Europe into Western Europe, and a lot of those successes do rely on the Open Society Foundation. Soros himself is an interesting and morally complex character, went to LSE, was a student of Karl Popper, which is, again, one of the main reasons I became more interested in him, because he is effectively what we call the philosopher investor, and has taken a lot of his philosophical training and skepsis and used that to make a boatload of money. I mean, he has made a boatload of money. So the practical application of these techniques, philosophical outlook, whether you want to call it stoicism or philosophy as a way of life, can lead to the incredible accumulation of, wealth and influence. So this idea that somehow these ideas are not related to investing, when so much of investing is self-control and kind of steely-eyed discipline, where it is self-discipline that really goes into determining your ability to accumulate a lot of wealth, because our natural inclination is to spend money, to enjoy ourselves. It's go out, eat, drink, and be merry. If that's our natural inclination, then it's quite interesting to see how this transforms. But I do think, though, that as you're looking at monetarist theory, or kind of just the theories that pervade the economy, I know I'm tossing a lot of these things out. I had a really weird childhood where growing up, me and my dad would talk about monetary theory from like the work of Milton Friedman on economics. So the Chicago School of Economics has been noted in championing this market fundamentalism. The American Enterprise Institute does this a lot, which I just find so curious, because when you actually go back and you actually read the source material, there's not a lot of opining for, like, even F.A. Hayek's The Road to Serfdom. What I just find so intellectually curious is when you're going through the ideas and you're talking to these guys, this market fundamentalism along with evangelical Christian fundamentalism, or really just fundamentalism in general. I don't know what it is with America and fundamentalism. We just seem to love it so much. Is that they're not advocating market fundamentalism as the be all end all to these problems. There is a recognition that there are market failures and there are certain subjects, because okay, like you have the guy who was trained by Karl Popper, who disagrees with Karl Popper on the unity of science, critiquing market fundamentalism. You have Peter F. Drucker, who's the grand Mac Daddy, close friends with Hayek, corresponded with Milton Friedman as well. New Ludwig von Mises, all these people know each other. The basic issue that you run into with all these guys is they are not fundamentalists. Yet you have ideologues and politicians who have taken unto themselves the mantle of these ideologies and spew this doctrine of continued fundamentalism, whether it be market fundamentalism or American fundamentalism. I digress a little bit, but this idea of, fundamentalism, or, you have guys like with the chart, you have the chart guys who do technical chart analysis. Those are so ridiculous. So now, one of the things that I do want to stick out is just the outsider element, where in the next section here, the secrets of a successful speculator. Soros was always an outsider. He was basically a philosopher who fled from Hungary and who needed to make some money. Soros's background is that of a survivor. His father, just given his Jewish background, I do kind of think it's important to know this. His father had to basically lie, connive, and get out of things. So his family didn't die during the Holocaust. And oh, by the way, all of these thinkers are also Jewish, which is just another thing I find kind of interesting. There's a great deal of thought that comes out of this. But, what he said, as a money manager, I was emotionally engaged in managing my fund. I manage it as if my existence depended on it, as indeed it did. I relied on my instincts and intuition as my conceptual framework to guide me through uncertainty. A number of factors conspired to increase my dependence on emotions. For one thing, I had less knowledge and information at my disposal than most other fund managers. I never studied security analysis. I was not part of a team, and I was ready to engage in a much broader range of activities than most others. I was not well established to perform better than others if I had tried to play the market by a particular set of rules. My competitive advantage lay in recognizing changes in the rules of the game. I started with He's relating to individual companies. With the passage of time, my interest veered increasingly towards macroeconomic themes. This was partly due to the growth of the fund and partly to the growing instability of the macroeconomic environment. For instance, exchange rates were fixed until 1973. Subsequently, they became a fertile field for speculation. So, this outsider perspective, or this ability to take really advantage of being an outsider, really does create an advantage for wealth creation, or it really sets you up to be an entrepreneur. I think that, again, why am I featuring this guy on a show called Skeptic Sunday? This emotion or this need that your entire survival relies on the decisions you're making or on the content you're generating really relates to a need to be successful if your entire life and your entire existence depends on it. So, for example, like when you're opening a business or you're in sales, like I am, my entire livelihood, my entire ability to not lose up my job relies on me tying up my very existence in the fact that I need to pick up the phone and dial and I need to cold call people. And that's what differentiates usually successful entrepreneurs from the unsuccessful, is this radical commitment to survival and the understanding of change. Just kind of harping back on the themes of this channel. If anybody new is joining the live stream, hey, hit me up with a comment. That's always good. Is this idea that skepticism is a radical commitment to change. It's a radical commitment to survival. There is no, the way of doing things that we've had for the last, like, let's say 50 years doesn't seem to be working. So it's tossing the baby out with the bathwater in order to actually continue to be successful and radically testing the assumptions of an organization. This skepticism outlines the work of Peter F. Drucker in great detail, and it really is a competitive advantage which Soros cultivated, which he might call emotional. I would call it, skeptical. The hunch, the idea that something's not right here, the skin change. He has a funny incident where his son criticizes him and he's like, my father comes up with this academic intuition, but he'd have a back pain, and that back pain would be the reason he would make an investment decision. So these willies or this intuition you have, it's very difficult to quantify it. Mihail Csikszentmihalyi, in his work on flow, talks about it a little bit, but these moments of just these flashes of insight come from adopting an outsider's mentality or constantly reviewing things. It's why I don't mix well with orthodoxy. I'm pretty comfortable with a world of uncertainties. Things not making sense, things being divided up. But that outsider mentality creates a series of advantages which do, over the long term, change us, make us more adaptable, and I believe ultimately more successful, like someone like Geroge Soros. So I do just want to quickly pull this up, as I'm thinking about this. So, hopefully this all begins to make sense for folks. So, what we're going to be taking a look at with this is, okay. Generally, it does help to open the control room for broadcast, eh? Okay, now I'm viewing this live in my control room. Nice. So I'm going to be just pulling up Soros here. Let me just get this up on screen. Okay, so hopefully we're here. Oh, do we only have one viewer? That's very sad for me. Okay. So in this view, let's just take a look at a few things with Soros. So let me just pull up my screen transition here. Oh, nice. Okay. So I'm going to go here and let me just.
Are sort of really moving towards Europe, but and the case in Russia, of course, is up for grabs. It's very much a struggle which way it's going to go. But there are other countries, like for instance,
between democratic forces and
well,
how would you characterize the alternative?
Well, it's sort of a new authoritarian regime based on nationalism. This is the
Zhirinovsky and others who think
right.
So this information that he is really going into right here, this interview is from 1995, which is why it's interesting. I did want to do something from Soros when he was more in his prime. His recent interviews from Davos and the World Economic Forum there were not super informative. These interviews just, his mental faculties have obviously eroded in his second language, and I didn't really think it would be fair to use one of those interviews from Soros as we're going into this. But interestingly, you can kind of see the prophetic nature here of just kind of describing the rise of a new right or authoritarianism in Russia based on Russia's Orthodox Christian identity. So Russia has become, in a way, anti-open society where we can see the protesting of LGBTQ, the reliance both in Poland and Russia on Christian national identity or Christian nationalism that we're even seeing in the United States towards this authoritarian veer. Highly interesting as we're seeing these events unfold. Even Peter F. Drucker's work from the early 2000s towards the end of his life has a very, predictive quality to it as you see the threads of fate unfold here, and that continues moving forward.
Is fading, right. But maybe Levitt is rising. Right. But whoever wants to win the elections will have to take a somewhat xenophobic anti-Western point of view, because people have been very disappointed by the changes which have occurred.
Well, in fact, Bill Safar in a column today in the New York Times pointed out that Boris Yeltsin, in order to win re-election, may become very strongly anti-Western in both the convention, both NATO as well as the conventional arms agreement.
When Yeltsin went to Poland the first time, he quite agreed to Poland joining NATO, and then his advisor said, "No, you can't let that go." And of course, the objections on Bosnia are very largely, playing to the domestic audience.
So a lot of this idea of playing to the domestic audience really centered on the decline of Russia as a great power. This decline really formed a lot of the basis of the thinking that we see going on from, as you see Russia kind of become a more nationalist state, you see a certain level of xenophobia that arrives. Really formed a lot of the basis of it becomes difficult, really formed a lot of the basis of the thinking that we see going on to grasp what the current environment is inside of Russia. So let's continue with this.
Latvians.
To the
Although-
ethnic community who's a domestic force in Russian politics.
Although, frankly, people in Russia don't give a damn about Bosnia. I mean, this is just grandstanding. It's not a real issue in Russia. They care about Chechnya. People deeply care about what happened in Chechnya. Bosnia is not an issue that is discussed outside Parliament.
And they care about Chechnya to the detriment of Boris Yeltsin and
Yes.
blame him for what happened.
People are very upset about that horrible incident. Yes.
But does he win re-election, you think?
Well, it's too early to say. First, you've got the parliamentary elections, and there is a hope of...
So this focus on kind of politics or the macroeconomic trends from a speculation is kind of like, why is finance talking about money? Why are we talking about politics, or why would we be concerned about political economy? Honestly, it's because it creates a lot of speculative opportunity, or it creates an opportunity to do well on terms of the financial market. Soros's main ideas here, as we're going to go through the course of this interview, are centered on the politics. Yeltsin's failures, or Yeltsin's inability to successfully navigate kind of this continued policy of glasnost. I mean, we can look at Ukraine, we can see the failure of privatization, the decline in quality of life in Russia, where really the collapse of the Soviet Union or the collapse of the Soviet state did not make the average Russian's quality of life all that much better.
Sort of a democratic center with this Chernomyrdin party, and Yavlinsky is doing well in the polls. But I'm afraid that the anti-reform elements may predominate.
Yavlinsky is someone you admire very much for his economic ideas.
Well, altogether, I have a great respect for him, because he's one man who actually stands by his ideas. He's really remained, let's say, clean in a society where very few people have been able to.
If someone came to you and said, have your foundation investments, the amount of money that you have through foundation, creating the university, Central European University,
yes.
creating the university, and other things you have done to promote the notion of an open society, have those seeds been worth the effort?
Yes.
Would you say yes, or would you say...
No question about it. I mean, I think that when you look at the entirety of what the foundations have done, it's been very worthwhile and very effective. Yet if you look at individual programs, many have failed. We have had many difficulties. In Russia, we have had about 3 putsches where the foundation had to be cleaned up. So it's been one long struggle with lots of difficulties. But when you look at the results, very rewarding.
Philanthropy for you is more rewarding than anything you do?
So, with the idea of the open society, or why is, this goes back to some of the earlier China content I did as well, looking at China as an open society or a prosperous society, or even a market, even a market-driven society. So this, this market fundamentalism, doesn't necessarily create an open society. You can see this in the United States, where honestly, political civility, political polarization since the Citizens United decision was handed down has inexorably increased, and that hasn't necessarily resulted in better policy. It hasn't resulted in better decision making at any level, and these overall levels of polarization or politicization do have a lot to do with the rise of fundamentalisms or isms in general, the basic problem I have with isms is going to Soros's ideas on the unity of science, these isms, authoritarianism, fascism, as well as, kind of like, I'm going to kind of call it, the nationalism or Christian nationalism, which has recently been criticized, on the left, as it's sort of been championed by the right, and even Jordan Peterson's a very strange ideologue based on some of the ideas that he is championing. So these ideas, though, don't necessarily have any benefit because they presuppose certainty in an uncertain and fundamentally unknowable world. So how can you assert an ideology as a true ideology or is truth when truth, as far as humanity is concerned, is fundamentally unknowable? We don't even know the basis of the structure of matter, and even in our universe, we can have general rules, but there's still chances that things aren't that way. And some things, while empirically knowable, where we know of gravity, we can grasp it at an empirical level, to assert truth can often be quite difficult. Yet these ideologies, like market fundamentalism or socialist fundamentalisms like Marxism, presuppose there's one way and one way only society ought to be ordered because it's part of a long unfolding of history, or that there is a story to history rather than, kind of, it's like the story of God or the story of redemption, where Christianity views the entire, the crucifixion as all of the universe has unfolded to this central drama and this central event being that of Revelation. Well, what if it's not? What if it's not? What if that really, really doesn't matter at all? That begins to raise a really interesting series of questions, does it not? So with Soros himself, this focus on philanthropy, or, is there a lot of purpose in money making? I do think that's important to note, because the things that made him a successful speculator didn't necessarily make him what I would call, a fulfilled person, or someone who was fulfilled, where he's kind of developed more of a focus on philanthropy, because the entire nature of his existence relied upon a business. His entire life, or his entire quality of life, was determined by this business, by this speculation. So what ends up happening is there is this unfolding where you begin to question, you begin to look at, is my life disordered? Have I lived a philosophical life, or have I lived kind of a life based on, pouring my existence into something that doesn't make me fulfilled?
Well, I've got great reservations about philanthropy. Actually, I really think that charity is a very corrupting activity, and it is so. Even in my own foundations, and I'm struggling against it all the time.
Where does the corruption come from?
Well, first of all, you corrupt the people that you give money to, because you don't teach them self-reliance, but you teach them to depend on you.
You teach them dependence rather than interdependence.
That's right. So you make them, they become objects of charity, which, we avoid. But then it's very corrupting to the giver, because people suck up to him. People will tell him people, when they go to a foundation, they tell the foundation what the foundation wants to hear. And then when they get the money, they do with it what they want to do. And the two are not the same.
Does it cause you to want to pull back from philanthropy because you believe that it might not be?
No, but I must say that I got sucked into something that I knew was full of paradoxes and contradictions.
Did you do it in the beginning because you had made so much money that you wanted to carry forward a philosophy you believed in?
Well, it had to do with that, in the sense that when I made more money than what I needed for my own good, I thought, how can I serve the public good? Until...
So I think that that's a very important idea that he just raised, this idea of charity is corrupting, or, we're going to give the giver what the giver wants to see. You can look at something like the scourge of voluntourism. For those of you not familiar with the term voluntourism, it's the idea that, somehow sending, all these rich students to developing countries will make things better because you build the school. There's plenty of stories of actual carpenters who are local coming in and fixing the work of the volunteers, because wouldn't it be better to just send $3,000 to these starving people so they can procure supplies instead of sending some 20-year-old with no practical skills in building or actual development or engineering? Would just be me. That would just be me. Again, it's different when a surgeon goes, brings a team of surgeons on one of the surgery hospital ships that travels between ports. These are actually making a practical difference in the lives of people. But charity in it of itself is not necessarily good. Charity does alter those who receive it, and like anything, can be a vice. Giving to people when you yourself are effectively a real evil person, or you really suck, doesn't wash away those crimes. It doesn't really atone for the actions. And a lot of the basic system we have settled for is, there's a certain portion of society that says the accumulation of wealth, this desire for more, is immoral because of the abuses, because of what happens to the workers. So that requires some degree of societal atonement. So with these pledges of people giving away money, I'm going to give away my entire fortune, it almost seems like there's a societal bargain where, in exchange for not having high taxes, in exchange for having this rapid accumulation of wealth, we expect people to atone, very in line with what Andrew Carnegie said, at least for those in the upper elite of wealth. Now, the skepticism of people asking for charity, the due diligence, the skepsis, this is something I appreciate about Soros's insights, because there's almost a very philosophical mindset into the actual giving of charity, because it's not like, hey, I'm going to give away billions and billions of dollars regardless of the impact. There is a careful weighing of the morality doing this. So that's kind of interesting, where we assume philanthropy is always the net good. We always assume some sort of philanthropic actions are moral. But there are cases where philanthropy or charity in and of itself is immoral. Just like with speculation, can we consider the actions of a speculator moral or immoral? If you see something, you see the ability to profit from it. Is that an immoral action? Are you really taking advantage of people, or are you just facilitating a transaction? So there are some moral considerations that go into these things, and I appreciate the thinking, or at least the process of the thinking that goes into each one of these things that Soros takes us through. So with those ideas in mind, let's continue a little bit more.
Quite recently, the foundations have not been driven by money. It wasn't that we had to give away a certain amount of money. unfortunately, it hadn't also been that we didn't have money to give in case there was a good cause. So it was really the merit of the particular project that mattered.
Let me talk about the business end and come back to the philosophical end for a second. There has been much talk about your comeback. During the bad times of certainly the beginning of '95, I guess, when did the comeback begin, when you began to once again connect?
Well, no, I don't. No, I think this shouldn't be taken out of context. We have had, several patches. We have an average performance of something like 35%
Over the last, since 1969.
20 odd years, 26 years. But it's made up of years which are 5% or 8%, and years that are 60% or 100%. That's how you get the average.
Yeah.
And we had 4 wonderful years, 90 to 93 inclusive. Right. And 94, we were only up 4%, which was our second worst year. And in the first half of this year, we were actually down when the market was up.
That's what I referred to.
And that was a sort of a bad patch.
But you have said, you're quoted as saying that somehow you began to feel somewhat that the forces were against you, in a sense. I mean, did you?
Well, we just didn't get it right. We had the
So I think it's kind of important, just when we're going through this book, or even like the rough patches, kind of see it here even as he's speaking. His thoughts have begun to go somewhere else. On the business questions, those are no longer really the this existential quest for survival. Really at this point in Soros' career it's really over. I mean, he's attained, a level of success that has firmly secured him as a survivor. And, I do want to throw on, the dimension here of, really this guy had nothing. I mean, this is a guy who had nothing. I mean, he was coming as a refugee fleeing the Holocaust to England, and was able, through money management, or kind of a guy looking to fund his philosophical education, to accumulate his fortune. But one of the more intriguing figures who emerged as a result of the tragedies of World War II really birthed this, what I think is a very interesting historical figure. And there are a lot of interesting investment characters who do live these very ascetic lives, which is what I find so interesting about a lot of the big shot investors. But I'm not saying that Soros lives an ascetic life like somebody like Warren Buffett does. But this kind of withdrawal after a 26-year run, the fund performance of 35% over that entire period per year, you begin to note in his writing of what made him a successful speculator. What made him a successful speculator, or what generally makes people a success, is that existential thirst, that existential hunger, or that desire for a conversion moment. I mean, in sales, like, usually the guy who's got a ridiculous amount of debt or has had something terrible happen to him, where his entire existential existence, his entire existence relies on picking up that phone. Or the quote I go with is, necessity is the mother of all invention, especially in the case of someone like George Soros, where what ends up occurring is, once the necessity is gone, we could even go through Maslow's hierarchy of needs, a little dated, but that existential demand, or that constant crisis you have to live under. In those crisis circumstances, the mind just eventually goes towards other things. And even in his book, his mind started going other places. But let's continue for a moment.
Opportunities were there. and we got caught. And it's sort of, it didn't hang together, but we got it together now.
All right, but stay with me, though. Let me explore this, because there is something, I think, for people to say. What happened when you were on such a roll that you began to hit the rough patch?
Right.
What did it do to you, and what did it cause you to question, and how did you come out of it?
Well, first of all, I'm immune because I've now got a young team.
I know.
They do all the work, you know, and I'm very supportive and I worry for them, but I don't really worry.
Well, Stanley Druckenmiller and people like that have gotten all the credit.
But they took all the pain,
Right.
because, you know, managing money the way we do is extremely painful. A very responsible job and very stressful. And I don't actually feel the stress. If I did, I probably wouldn't be able to sit here and talk to you. So that's number one.
You don't feel the stress anymore because it's not your judgments that are on the line?
I'm not on the line.
Right.
They are on the line, and I'm just stand behind them. I'm coach,
Right.
and they are performing. It's
Right.
you know.
You're
of
the
course,
coach and Stanley's the quarterback, isn't it?
So, I mean, that's kind of an interesting metaphor where you're the coach and Stanley is the, Stanley's the quarterback. That's kind of like a lot of these day traders or people here on YouTube seem to switch over to, offering courses, or even sellers. Sellers try to get out of selling. They try to go do something like coaching, which is, where people wash out of sales and they go into marketing. That's always extremely interesting to me because, you're no longer under pressure. You're no longer under the gun. You have somebody working for you. It's marvelous. It's magical. Your life is no longer inextricably drawn into something. It's no longer your life that matters. You're no longer at risk. So what this means for a lot of folks is, why would I continue caring about this? Why is it important? And I would answer that pretty simply as, these things, like once you're no longer in it, once it's not your neck on the line, it becomes pretty interesting to see what's going on. You're not engaged anymore. There's no reason for you to want to survive. So the stress is gone. The visceral feedback or getting crushed alive if you make the wrong move in a high stakes game or a high pressure game is actually extremely interesting, because what are you supposed to do as things go boom and as things happen more? What do you do to cope with the stress? There is no more stress where once you're like, oh, I made my money and I'm out of it. That need to survive, once you're no longer living a hand-to-mouth existence, takes away a really strong impulse or a desire to fight that makes people successful. And you can kind of hear, Soros speaking here, where really, he's hit the nadir of his success and he has exited the game. He's not going to continue with this. He's gone. He's out of it. He's not going to be continuing with this anymore. So that really begs the question, why are we seeing this from Soros? What's going on here? And why is this happening with him? So let's continue.
So of course I'm involved, you constantly re-examine what you're doing wrong, and you slowly you tentatively get things right, but you can't really get a dynamic going until you have a little profit under your belt, because it's very different when you're risking your principal than when you're risking your profit. So that's how you get these runs when you're you get it right, and then you can risk more and make more money. When you have lost it, when you are doing poorly, you've got to retrench. And even as you get it right, you don't get the performance until you can do it on a larger scale, because risking your profit, you see, is much easier.
It's less terrifying than risking your principal.
Yeah, I mean, the reason we have such a good record is because we never lose our principle. Once we get, we are in a bad position, we retrench. So we might lose a little bit, but we'll never endanger
because you leverage well.
That's right. We deleverage when we are not making money.
You stop leveraging. I assume that's what deleveraging means.
Yeah.
But in the sterling coup, which would not coup, in the investment there.
I do just want to kind of go here for a second, where what he's talking about in terms of the accumulation of the money, where this this risk, where we never lose our principal. We never take a risk on our principal. We never lose principal, or we never lose really the money we've spent a long time saving. This is really important for people. And the reason that this is really important for people is, with a business or a business failure, if you're risking your principal, or if you're risking your own money, it gets a lot more. If you're risking every penny every time, it's going to take you a lot longer to recover or to actually go in and build your business. So this ends up meaning that you're going to have to spend like 15 to 20 years saving for another business. People get eaten alive where they risk all of their capital, or they risk everything, and there's really no profits in the business, and you can't even really retrench through cost cutting or even exercise, the process of deleveraging. I would say Soros's success is, even the skill he learned from his father, is being a survivor and always surviving. So Soros is noted in his success for not undergoing a Pyrrhic victory or Pyrrhic victory, depending on how you want to pronounce that, where, it's a win, but that win completely destroys you, and there's not going to be any other success that comes from you out of it. So that deleveraging, or being very selective about the kind of risks you are willing to take, is really critical to how Soros went about making his investments. Because again, the idea that you're really only ever risking your profit instead of your actual principal. Simple advice to follow, but incredibly difficult to implement, because it's the same idea where, when you have a fundamentalist, and I go back to my harping on fundamentalism, common theme on the stream where we get these fundamentalists, the basic issue that you run into is with these fundamentalists or these fundamentals, you're looking at consuming your entire existence. You're not leaving yourself time to take care of yourself. You really have no dividend. You have no ability. You have no profit, basically, to invest. So when you're living this hand-to-mouth existence of, hey, let me go, start a business, you're really taking on a great deal of risk, and you're going to go, and you're going to probably lose your shirt. Like with, with credit card reward points, where I have an interest in cards, I'm not risking any of my principal. There's no risk going on to me. My spending is kind of getting retrenched at the moment because I sense it's higher than it should be, since I went out and I got myself some omakase sushi, incredibly tasty. Me and my girlfriend both would agree on that. Oh, which is the sad point in my day. A lot of coffee. How sad. Maybe the coffee fairy will bring me something here. But with that in mind, what ends up occurring is, as Soros is outlining here, you need to survive. The basic philosophical commitment or the key to success in entrepreneurship or investing is the surviving and strategic leverage. So you can't lose your principle. And it's very interesting sometimes to hear, Dave Ramsey talk, where he like goes through this entire, terrible loss. So let me give you a good example of why it's possible for somebody like Dave Ramsey to be successful in America. But, Dave Ramsey would have ended up being a terrible failure in Spain. So bankruptcy in Spain is like, in Spanish, is literally ir a las ruinas, which means to go to ruin. Quite literally, that's what it translates to. So you're ruined. You're not bankrupt, you're ruined. Spanish bankruptcy law is highly, highly restrictive. So if you lose your home, you're still on the hook for that mortgage. Even if the bank has repossessed it, sold it, you still have to continue paying interest on it for the rest of your life. And there's basically zero chance you're ever going to be able to buy a home again, given how stringent Spanish mortgage requirements are. So it's not like in the United States, it goes away after 7 years, you are ruined. You are literally ruined. It is impossible to take, risk through leveraging up. So worst case worse, okay, like I go sleep on my parents' couch for 7 years. I mean, that's really probably the worst thing that's going to happen, from a bankruptcy. So you can predict through the consequences of, what's the worst thing that's going to happen, and you can still end up getting a clean start. But in other countries, and this is a very important consideration of, an open society, as Soros is outlining, is the ability to actually get a fresh start. It's why student loans not being bankruptable has caused a lot of suffering for people my age, because you don't get the ability to reset things. The loans never go away. You never get a second opportunity. And that fundamentally makes a society not open. So the idea that we should still have student loans be non-bankruptable, it's pretty barbaric when you really think about it.
Where you captured the attention of the world, and certainly the Bank of England.
Right.
Did you put $10 billion at risk or not?
Yes.
Now, was that all profit or was that principal?
Well, it was our principle, but it was not all at risk, because the most we could have lost would have been, let's say, 2-3%, because there was no. It was a high reward, low risk bet.
Right.
But if it had gone wrong, we would have had the transaction cost of undoing it. Right. Whereas if we got it right, we made something like 15-20%. So we did put all our equity at risk, but it wasn't, it wasn't really very much of an
exposure. $10 billion, you were risking a billion or
less, even less.
Even less.
That was substantially less.
Yeah.
We made a billion, but we made more than a billion actually. But we could have lost a few hundred million, which would have been perfectly acceptable.
1995. I want to move past business, but stay with me for a second. In 1995, the beginning of 95, when you began to, it was a rough patch. Did you change your ideas about macro investing and looking at everything at that time? Did you call into question any part of your philosophy about investing or your practices over the previous 25 years?
Not the philosophy, not the approach, but every one of our position was very much re-examined. Yeah. And actually, one of the things.
So, I mean, with the philosophy, or, what is he doing, in terms of risk, or is the risk going to, is the risk going to totally bankrupt you? It's like another common theme on this channel is, why should you have insurance, or why is insurance incredibly important? One of the reasons insurance is incredibly important is, it allows you to successfully leverage. So the successful leverage comes from limiting your actual losses. So the The Option Trader's Hedge Fund is an extremely interesting book on finances, since it actually looks at this idea of running your own options trading portfolio essentially as an insurance business. So you're always, for lack of a better term, self-insuring or limiting and hedging the amount of risk you're actually taking. So 2% risk, get 15%. He's not risking a great deal of actual money, but there's this magnification through options and through the leverage that Soros is using to really just make an incredibly outsized profit. So Soros's own ideas here are extremely intriguing. But again, none of his actual equity or capital is at risk.
We did was to focus more on individual stocks,
Yes.
And not just the macro, because the macro is one bet. You
Right.
see, whereas if you select particular stocks, you have a thesis concerning an industry or a company, then you have, let's say, a division of risk, so you can do a little more.
Yeah. When your philosophy about equity investments when looking at a company has to do with management, has to do with...
Right now it does, because this is an era of high capitalism, if you like, where the interests of the shareholders rule supreme, and managements pay a lot of attention.
I don't like the use of the term philosophy in terms of selecting stock. Philosophy implies, some sort of, wisdom here, or actually being engaged with what's going on. I think a term like philosophy should really be reserved for things like theology, like ideas or something of that nature, because again, it doesn't make a great deal of sense for us to be talking about a philosophy. It makes more sense to be talking or engaging about a method. So these methods, or the method that Soros is really talking about, it seems like he's this highfalutin risk taker when you talk about the man who broke the Bank of England, but there is an almost surgical skepticism to how Soros is approaching things that really brings alive a lot of what he's talking about. So the surgical application of credit in investing, or margin, where you're able to leverage up on a position, is really, really dangerous. I mean, it's so damn dangerous. And most people, even as you're listening to Soros, where you're kind of engaging in this analytical reflection, or even as he's talking about his emotions, just keeping those emotions in check enough. I mean, we're talking about back pains from emotion, where he'd be laid up in bed for a couple days trying to analyze these emotions, or trying to understand what's going on. And I think that is really, really intriguing, especially when we're talking about Mr. Soros here, because of what's going on. There's always this room for additional examination. There's always room for a look at, what are the ideas he's talking about? What are the investments? What is he going into? And I'm definitely trying to decide if this is a good time to live stream, or if I should have just done the poop it's live to create those notifications instead of scheduling this one out, for Skeptic Sunday at 11 a.m. Since it doesn't appear we've had a big audience turnout today. Now has it, guys? But nonetheless, we shall continue with skepticism. So again, with most of what Soros is talking about his method or his approach to investing is based on skepticism. It's based on a certain suspension of judgment about these positions, even when his emotions are running amok. You can hear him talking about theses, and a thesis is just a hypothesis. That thesis may or may not be disproven. It's as if he's engaging in an intellectual debate about his investment choices. So let's... Oh, here comes Mr. Doggy. It's a Mr. Doggy. Yay, it's the coffee patrol. Coffee. Yay. Yay for me. Ooh, hot coffee. It's very hot coffee. Okay, so now let's go back into this actual Soros interview. I will segue a little bit more towards some other content as we continue this exciting segment of Geroge Soros. Let's get going, guys. Okay.
To the interest of the shareholders, and if you can
and
find...
that's a change you find, that there's much more of a sensitivity to shareholders and return to shareholders than been in the past.
That is correct. And therefore, if you can identify managements which are changing their attitude or where there's a change of management, you can be very well rewarded.
Yeah. You say this is a golden age of capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
It continues.
Yes.
What is it about where we are economically in the world, looking at it globally, that makes you optimistic about capitalism?
Well, don't
put words in your mouth.
No, please don't, because I'm not so optimistic. In fact, I'm pretty sure that this golden age is not going to last forever because it's built on false foundations. We've had a similar period, let's say, at the end of the last century, and it didn't last. You had global markets. Money didn't move as fast as it's moving now, but it moved just as much. It was very similar to what we have today. In fact, it was more stable than what we have today because, first of all, you had the gold standard as opposed to the fluctuating currency system, which is much more unstable that we have now. And secondly, you had an imperial power, England, that was the main beneficiary of this global trading system, the City of London. Yes. And they were perfectly willing to send a gunboat or two to faraway places in order to, put down the native, keep the natives in place.
To maintain the empire.
That's right. We don't have that now because the United States is the sole remaining superpower, but is not the main beneficiary of this global trading system. And therefore, we can't be the policeman of the world. We can't afford it. We don't want to be. And therefore, there is no policeman. And there's no imperial power. There is no balance of powers as you had during the Cold War, when you had these two superpowers sort of keeping each other in check. So you have a vacuum, a power vacuum. You have instability. And this is actually one of the main points I make in the book. This cannot last like this. We actually need an international security system. And
this is an interesting point in this idea of a system. So latent U.S. nationalism has been very opposed to the idea of an international system. In fact, when I say opposed, I mean let's just be outright just going bonkers against it, or the idea that somehow there needs to be, a more centered international way of doing things, or a new balance of power. Just in terms of like macroeconomic trends here. So a lot of the profits to be made, I don't necessarily think those profits are necessarily U.S.-China conflict. I think India and India's place in the world is really going to drive a lot of potential profit opportunities. I'm still amazed at how ignorant I am of the Indian economy. I think I'm going to be starting to do more of a segment way on that, or even an economy like Indonesia, where there is still a lot of underlying political stability. There is a lot of hope towards democracy, or even within Eastern Europe. As things begin to evolve, I think this situation in Russia is going to result in quite a few interesting changes, to the global balance of power. And as much as it seems to drive Americans nuts, there is a decline in America's overall power, its ability to express itself. I would say American influence in Ukraine versus Russia has really been a thorough expression of American, or at least Western power, compared to Russia and these closed authoritarian societies. I think the collapse of Russia in Ukraine is actually going to be a very good thing for world peace in general, where these closed and rigid societies prove very brittle. Russia has a terrible record at waging offensive war. Why a Russian leader would wage an offensive war is a bit mind-boggling. The only wars that they've ever actually really won are defensive ones, where the enemy chases them into Russia and gets destroyed by winter. But that doesn't work too well, apparently, in Ukraine, where they're just fighting other Russians. Should have thought about that one, I suppose. Now, let's continue here.
And the trouble is that the United Nations has failed just at a time when it would be most needed.
Bosnia being one perfect example.
Bosnia has been to the United Nations as Abyssinia was to the League of Nations in 1935. It showed that the League of Nations doesn't work.
Proved its impotency.
That's right. And this is an issue for us, particularly for the United States, because we created the United Nations. It's our design. We are the leading power, but we say the United Nations failed. They failed. Yeah. It's us that have decided not to.
For a number of reasons, including the fact that the rest of the world, and certainly the Western world, Japan and Europe, Bosnia being one small example, is looking to us for leadership.
Yes.
Is that just a failure of this administration or failure of a mindset in America about our role in the world?
I think it's a bipartisan issue.
Right.
I think that the Republicans have to make up their minds whether they want to support the United Nations or not. I think that, and if they don't, what role are we going to play in the world?
So this idea of the United Nations or the United States' decision to retreat from international organizations, again, poses an interesting, economic opportunity for those who willing to speculate, or look for contrarian bets, because it just seems a little intriguing to me that this is kind of the future, or this is what we're focused on even today. This idea that we should withdraw from international organizations, we should pursue an America first, more isolationist foreign policy. These things continue to today. The turmoil around those things potentially creates profit opportunity, just like any instability does. So let's just continue a little bit more. But again, I think the ideas and themes that Soros is developing here are very consistent. I don't like the idea of an investing philosophy. I like the idea of an investing method. There's not really there's kind of like the scientific method, or just method in general. These methods require certain suspension of disbelief, or there's an approach to investing where maybe it's macroeconomic investing through options or speculation, which is how Soros has really made a ton of money. That is an extremely interesting idea, but let's continue.
Stay with me on that. In terms of Bosnia and what the Clinton administration has done, are you supportive because of your concern for what's happened to the children of Sarajevo?
Look, I think that we did finally You see, when actually the survival of NATO became an issue, because NATO got involved and it lost its credibility. And for us, maintaining the credibility of NATO is what really moved us. And also to help Clinton in his re-election campaign.
Because to be strong in foreign policy.
Yeah, because there was a great weakness there, so he had to do something. Well, it just, once we took action, it seems to have an effect. I mean, it has moved the situation dramatically. Now, unfortunately, it happened too late, and while it is beneficial in the sense of bringing the end much closer, the damage that has been done, it cannot be undone, and we must really recognize this as a terrible failure. And
so, you think a Winston Churchill quote does apply here about America. Just kind of growing up in America, and just you can always rely on the Americans to do the right thing once they've done everything else. That is pretty much like our natural, like our motto. We're gonna do everything else except the obvious thing. That is a very American approach to problem solving. We will try every way to solve a problem, but the obvious solution, because who knows, that just seems too easy, and we never do things the easy way. In America, there will never be an American solution to the problem that is the easy way to do something. At least at the federal level and in most state governments as well. It just seems like, let's try this. Let's go ahead and try this, and we'll see what happens. Let's just skip ahead a little bit, since I don't think
really a bipartisan agenda, and I don't think I can advance it by sort of taking sides.
Let me talk about you and your biography, which we have talked about before on this program. Born in Hungary, when you were 14 years old, your father taught you, you say, in a masterful way, the art of survival.
Yeah.
What did you mean?
Well, because, this was the German occupation. We would have been taken away, and
so. I think that this is, I think this will be a more elucidating aspect than hearing Soros talk about politics. There's a certain, even the death of Socrates in politics, where Socrates is taught, there's a basic, like within a democratic society, we see how kind of, getting into power is highly corrupting. You can see some of the political corruption that took place in, Russia, or even the continued desire to accumulate, the desire to accumulate wealth, this act of acquisition, these actions can be quite detrimental to you or to who you are. So actions do have consequences. Even a good action can have extremely negative consequences. But, this fight to survive against Germany, against forces that were really seeking his elimination, really fostered this, you don't really have a lot of, room for some of these conversations. I mean, when your very survival is at stake, or you're going to die, or you're not going to earn any money, like when you're a commission-based salesperson, you don't really have a lot of time to play, Mr. Nice Guy. Your survival is inexorably linked up with what you're doing. There's no, oh, hey, Mr. Nice Guy, I'm gonna just wait for things to happen. What very simply occurs is you get your butt whooped, or you get punched in the face, and you need to react to that punch. There is no, there's no tomorrow, and there's just a lot of survival. Or, just going with the book Philosophy is a Way of Life by Pierre Hadot, this philosophical decision is the decision to survive, decision to change. You can see history is replete with people who have conversion stories where basically they finally have confronted death, and this decision to really cultivate a practice of death, or why you've convinced yourself you're going to die, and that realization of your mortality drives a lot of change. That's cultivating a mentality of survivorship. So let's continue here.
Killed. And he had enough sense because of his previous experiences to realize that the normal
What do you mean
rules,
his previous experience?
Well, he was a prisoner of war in Russia,
right.
And he escaped, and he lived through the Russian Revolution, and he came back from that a changed man because he saw this turmoil, fighting, and I mean he went through a horrendous experience, and that taught him a lesson which then came in very useful. And he in turn taught me a lesson which came in useful to me.
Which is the art of survival, which is,
well,
tell
it's
me more.
basically that there are times when the normal rules don't apply. You see, the way you've looked at the world is just not applicable because the world has changed. It's a revolutionary situation.
When has it been applicable in your life, and when has it been?
So I think that is extremely important. So there are just times where the normal rules don't apply. Rules go out the window, or the decision to survive is really what drives a lot of it really drives a lot of the organization. So I work in managerial consulting as my day job. Fun. Really strategy consulting. And one of the things with disruptive innovation, or when these new innovations, things like CRISPR, have come onto the market, how clients approach things, even legislative changes, what ends up mattering is just the commitment to survival, or where fundamentally the rules of the game just do, those rules just no longer apply. And you need to be more direct, you need to be more vigorous in your outreach, and you need to continue surviving. That's what matters. So the art of survival is, okay, these rules or the way of doing things no longer really seems to apply. I need to survive. This gets corrupted into, this gets corrupted a lot by financial charlatans and people who are asking for payment, about what they're actually teaching. And I think that's a problem. I really do think that that's a problem, because they're essentially taking advantage of your art of survivorship, or your desire to survive, by selling you some solution and teaching you, hey, this is going to be the way that you're going to need to survive. So again, let's continue.
Employed in your life?
Well, it was certainly had this experience with the Nazi regime, then the communist regime, the beginnings of the communist regime, and then actually I've kind of specialized on these far from equilibrium situations in the financial markets. That's been my specialty.
But explain more.
In other words, changes, you see, people generally play with a certain set of rules. Right. And I am particularly interested in changes in the rules of the game. And so I'm looking for the new game and the new rules, how they are played. So because I'm attuned to that, I can sort of sometimes anticipate or understand these periods of regime change when something really new is happening. Let's say anything to do with technology, let's say internet is something really revolutionary. It's something probably comparable to the invention of printing, and is happening currently. Now that changes a lot of things in technology stocks.
And was that the reason for the investors' enthusiasm for Netscape?
That's right.
Right.
That's right. No, that may be, of course, an over.
Sure.
So I do think, I just want to break out here for a second. I think that Soros is raising another extremely intriguing point, and that point is looking into or looking at the actual investments as revolutionary change, or when a new game has fundamentally emerged. So, clinging to the old way of doing things, or looking for rules, looking for ways to change things. New circumstances require tactical changes. And a lot of these tactical changes are not necessarily things people are, extremely comfortable with, or extremely excited, or extremely excited by. Internet replacing newspapers. Has that really fully occurred? Has it been as disruptive as people thought? It's an interesting question, but let's continue.
Exuberance, but still, that is far from equilibrium. That's a revolutionary change.
That is just the internet, in your judgment, the World Wide Web, is as important as the printing press.
Yes, I think it will change, the way we do many things. Not just, the way we do research, the way we do our shopping, the way we communicate with people. To a large extent, I think it will replace television, because it will replace the newspapers, because we'll probably get the information sort of collated for us.
Yes.
So
You're absolutely right in 1995 about the investment impact of the internet. So now this question, though, goes into something like blockchain technologies, which I find extremely interesting. Have cryptocurrencies changed the rules of the game? I think that's an interesting question when you start looking at the blockchain itself, or decentralized ledgers, where we're starting to look for places to speculate where the rules of the game have changed. I'm going to be doing a follow-up video next week on Cathie Wood's approach to disruptive investing, where she's looking for things that really are going to change the game. And the issue I have with that investment approach, or I have with it, is we don't know what things are going to change the rules of the game. So Soros here is talking about, the rise of the internet, which has very much been true. But when you look at the internet itself, it's really been dominated by search. Now we're seeing a lot more reliance due to processing power and easy download speed on video. So video content, due to, let's just say, the evolution of 5G, is becoming much more readily consumable on mobile devices. So there's more of an evolution, and which innovations are going to win out. Is it going to be fuel cells, or is it going to be electric vehicles, which will win out over the long term? We don't really know, because for example, a electric car is nearly as polluting, since you're still fundamentally producing power from pollutants or fossil fuels. So I think that with Cathie's approach, there's a lot of questions that can be asked. Now let's continue.
It's two difficult to anticipate.
But do you
all the
have a
changes.
clear vision?
No, I don't have a clear vision. I just have a vision that there's some
You know that there's a
revolutionary
moment of change.
I have a chaotic vision, not a clear vision.
You have a moment, but you know there's a moment of change here taking
That's
place
right.
because
Yeah.
of the internet.
Yes.
Because it changes the way the world speaks to each other.
That's right.
The
That's
individuals in the world, and gives people the capacity to go around institutions
Right.
that they or have access to institutions in a different way. It sort of
That's right.
democratizes
That's right.
in a way.
Yeah, it will
globally.
it will change many things. So that's one example. But I mean, you take let's say Europe, the integration and disintegration of Europe. Those are what we talked about. It makes me bearish on the French market. So those are the changes that I look at.
Now, does that still mean you adhere to macro investing, or is it?
Oh, yes, of course,
And that
of course,
basically
yes,
is looking
yes.
at looking at a series of forces that you think,
Yes.
whatever the currency you're looking at, whether it's bonds or stocks
Right.
or commodities or currency.
Right. Well, if it's a macroeconomic change, then you've got sort of macro instruments like.
So you can see a lot of this where, what are the tools he's using, a lot of speculation in both currency as well as index fund futures versus actually buying the index fund itself. So with these options contracts, the buying and selling of the contracts, you get into pretty interesting territory with the actual macro investments. But I do think that with Soros in particular, there is, there's a lot of concern you may be able to have, or a lot of concerns you can raise about his overall approach to investment or investment decision making, which I do think bear more consideration. So let's continue here.
Bonds,
Right.
or which allow you to play them.
Yeah. How have you changed after all of this money and all of this attention? I mean, what has it caused you to do with the way you live your life and choices you make for yourself?
Well, I think it empowered me in many ways. I mean, it has given me freedom, and it has also given me an ability to have much greater impact than otherwise. And of course, with that goes the responsibility. What kind of impact do you want to make, right? So it really makes you think. So I've become, let's say, a more effective person, but now I've become also a more reflective person, because my own life has changed, and I need to think things through again. And actually, the book is an attempt to do so.
But this is thinking out loud in terms of questions about
Yes.
who you are and the philosophy. You have suggested one role model for you was John Maynard Keynes, and both because he was an investor and a theoretician, because he had
Yeah, I mean,
Keynes.
So it's kind of interesting where we're going into John Maynard Keynes. I need to pull up Keynes as well. So, I mean, there's going to be a deep dive more into, with some of the skeptical content, more biographics or deep dive editions as we start going into things a little bit more. But I think one of the largest changes, or one of the things that I find so intriguing about Soros, is really his own just search, or this constant reevaluation of, as these changes come, I'm looking for something that really allows me to change. That constant learning, that constant reflection permeates a lot of what Soros is doing. Let's just continue here.
Keynesian philosophy about
the
way the markets work.
Yeah, I mean, it's just sort of, I was asked, well,
I know,
do you
but
have any models? So, I mean,
I'm not suggesting you're comparing yourself to Keynes, but you look at someone who had a life And you say he
Well,
was
I
a
think that's
philosopher.
I think that's a full life. You see, to actually to participate and to think, to interact. I mean, for me, thinking and understanding is the most important thing. But for many years in my youth, I was deeply involved in profound philosophical questions, and I went on over and over the same questions until I was really spinning my wheels. I wasn't getting anywhere. Then I entered the real world, and I moved forward. You see, my wheels grabbed on, and that has enabled me to bring my own thinking forward. So let's say the conceptual framework, which I outlined there, I formed it.
Do you think that this is again another idea, that I do, I do want to harp on this idea of a full life or living your life, living your life fully. What differentiates, Soros from, say, an academic philosopher and makes him, quite interesting is this focus on living a full life or shifting between different things. So even extremely successful, even controversial figures, someone like Churchill, who was an orator, war hero, really this this life-size figure, especially as a writer, he seemed to have lived could be seen to have lived a full life. So it's not just this one-dimensional life built on work, 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 work. And, at least in this idea of the open society does go back towards some of these philosophical questions where you're predominantly interested in living a full life or a life that is actually full of some degree of meaning. That really seems to permeate at least a lot of the thinkers that I am interested in are people who are living a full life. And there are a great number of people who, when you look at their lives, just take, I think Bill Gates is a good example, where there's this cheating, there's this lack of, satisfaction in your life. The question begins to emerge, has this person lived a full life, or is that life, really, just focused on living, for the acquisition of wealth? There are different stages of life where life becomes about other things, where you can hear Soros's language change as really, and this really caps off. I mean, his investment career was basically, he had a good 25-year run where he had his career, and then it was time to retire, and it was time to move on. It was effectively just time to turn the page and go on with the second story of his life. So he's interesting in that, the question of midlife, or this midlife crisis, as people need to retire, they need to move on, are these people continuing to live full lives, or is there something preventing us from truly living a full life? Be it kind of continued obsession with work, continued obsession with gaining money. Now let's continue.
It in my student days, but I've developed it a lot further. See, so I think that I'm,
What did markets teach you about your philosophical framework?
Well, it was a laboratory where I could test my ideas. And
because it is a hard-headed, very realistic laboratory.
Yeah, it's a hard taskmaster.
Yes,
You see. So there is such a thing as reality. Okay, there's one should realize, and funny thing to say that the market is reality, because it seems to be so far removed from reality. But that is actually a very good example of what reality is, because all the false ideas and misconceptions that we have and which play in the market, okay, is part of the reality that we have to think about. So the role of misconceptions is...
So this again gets us into pretty interesting territory of what constitutes reality, or what is reality. I think that's a pretty interesting perspective, or where are we actually making our decisions? I mean, it's a little hard to not go into philosophical for me on this channel, but it's kind of an interesting book I'm reading in translation. And yes, in case you're wondering, Leo, the Spanish water dog, did kind of destroy it a bit. This idea of Platonic theology. Oh man, this is just like kind of like a big old nerd out here. But just in terms of the actual philosophy itself, I think it's really, I think it's important to understand what's going on here. So let's kind of continue with this idea of living a full life, or living your life in reality. A little bit weird on the skeptical side, but you can kind of hear this guy with like philosophy, is in line with emotion. You can almost get the sense of, there's just something outside you that just taps on this intuition of the unknowable reality. There's a certain degree of mystery and serendipity begins to emerge that I just find really...
It's tremendously important in forming reality.
Yeah.
You see, that
the reality of the market is infused by your recognition of all the misassumptions that go into it.
You see, one of the major misconceptions, which we sort of started with the Greek philosophers and then was reinforced by science, the success of science, is that our thinking is here and reality is there. And there's a correspondence between the two. We try to understand what's out there. But in effect, our thinking is part of the reality that we are trying to understand. You see, so instead of thinking of two parallel things, we have to realize that there is one big thing, which is reality. Okay.
So I think that is kind of important, where it's like this idea of reality, or the cognitive function with facultative. We go into all the wonderful functions and stuff as well. Is that within the work of Soros, something begins to emerge where what we're actually seeing is this focus on this idea that we're still part of reality. So it's very difficult to engage in kind of this fiction, this fixed nature, or these abstractions. But let's continue here.
Okay. And there really is such a thing, and we are part of it. And being part of it, we can't possibly encompass it, understand it fully. And our conceptions about what that thing is, usually misconceptions, is part of it. Yeah. So it's an evolving reality. It's a self-generating reality. The more we understand, the better we can cope with it, the more sophisticated our civilization becomes. The more complicated, the more there is to understand.
What do you think is the best? I want to come to the markets and how you feel about the fact that the markets are not perfect. Well, let me go to that first. Yeah. Do you think the markets are not perfect?
Well, I think one of the misconceptions prevailing is that there's such a thing, rational expectations, right. Efficient markets, and so on. I think that basically markets, it's closer to the truth to say that markets are always wrong. Yeah. Than to say that they're always right. Okay? They're not always wrong, but
yeah, it's closer to the truth. You also think there should be some regulation of markets, and while we have regulations from country to country to country, there is no regulation, in a sense, a global regulation.
No, we'll see what I put forward is that financial markets are inherently unstable. And to preserve stability, it has to be the objective of policy to introduce or to preserve stability. And in fact, we have the central banks whose job it is.
So I think that that is, kind of important, or, there's, this idea of can stability exist in a constantly changing world? I mean, that's an interesting question of itself. Could something be stable while at the same time being, inherently ever changing? I mean, it's a little paradoxical. So I do think there's an interesting subtext here of, what we're talking about, we're part of a wider reality, or we can't really divorce ourselves from reality. I think that that is interesting because just as we're kind of going into Platonic theology, there is there's a certain phenomenological perspective there, or, how do phenomena arise? How are they experienced? I do think that that merits a little bit of investigation as well. But I would like to continue in this vein. Let's keep going just towards end. There will, of course, be intermittent commentary here.
We have the SEC that oversees the securities market. But we now have a global market, and we don't have global institutions. And we still need regulation, and we really have to do something.
But I should point out that the quantum fund is an offshore fund.
Yeah, well, I know what I'm speaking about.
I should tell you.
I don't mind regulation as long as it doesn't single out our fund. As long as it applies to everyone equally.
It's okay to regulate, but don't regulate offshore funds.
No, it's all right to regulate offshore funds as long as they are not singled out. And particularly we are not singled out.
For reprimand or for punitive.
Right,
okay.
Right.
You would like to see some regulation of derivatives.
Yes. I think that clearly the instability in the yen showed that.
It's like, hello, we need to regulate derivatives. Lo and behold, what came true with the 2007 recession caused by excessive derivative instrument usage. I just think it's really, really intriguing. Just looking at how right this guy was as you're predicting out changes from 10 years ago, I just think that it's kind of comical. So let's just continue here.
Options can be very disruptive. They were very disruptive in the '87 crash. That portfolio insurance was the use of a derivative. And it was recognized, and then so-called circuit breakers were introduced. So I think that there is a need to recognize that derivatives can be destabilizing because they bring about trend-following behavior, automatic trend-following behavior by the people who have sold the options. And when the market goes against them, they have to engage what is called dynamic hedging.
Yeah. Do you worry when you look at the Barron's Bank situation and the situation in Japan that there are throughout the world that there are these rogue traders who can cover their mistakes without being detected for a period of time?
I don't think it's anything new. I think they've been around since the 18th century, or even in antiquity.
So is new the volume? Is that what's new? The stakes, the money?
Even maybe the size of the defaults are, because the size of the institutions is different. I think we have always had those little mishaps, and we'll continue to have them. And we have a lot of regulations and internal controls, and it's only when they break down that you have these incidents.
You are, 60-something, right?
65.
65. What do you want to do with the rest of your life? What is it that you hope you can accomplish?
So again, just as Pete's still here at 65, I mean, listening nearly 28 years later as the man marches towards 100, it's just kind of why I wanted to do an interview where I still consider Soros to be his prime. was, the themes that unfold here are, one, there's a certain philosophy involved with his investment choices. I don't feel like there's any rock star personalities. I don't feel like there's any cult. There's no cult-like following associated with Soros. Where some investors or some specific investors who will be diving into more, someone like Cathie Wood in particular, and I think the cult of Tesla, these do come to mind as two of the investment groups I'm not particularly looking forward to engaging with. Some of the ideas contained in this idea of kind of the spawn of Boston Consulting Group and disruptive innovation. But I do think there are a number of important considerations to be examined, particularly from Cathie Wood's approach compared to Geroge Soros's, where you're looking at things being either fundamentally grounded in skepsis or not. So this approach, or focus on skepticism, is something that I think we can derive a lot of benefit from, and we can engage with a little bit more. So just in terms of things going on with the channel this week, just as we're heading up on time here today for Skeptic Sunday, thank you so much for everyone who's tuned in live to this broadcast. We're going to be continuing to kind of trudge along. Got an exciting guest planned with Dr. Jonathan Wharton for October 23rd, where we'll be looking at the socio and political aspects of phenomena like Brexit, increased US politicization, whether we think that's going to affect macro trends like state economies, whether people want to live in certain areas like Texas due to recent legislative changes. So I think we're going to have a really well mapped out series of shows on the horizon for this week, and trying to get some more guests here for Skeptic Sunday on the whole. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know by joining Thematic Insights Discord community, where we're committed to talking about things such as philosophy of investing, as well as just leading a full life in general with your money and trying to live a more contemplative and reflective life. So with that in mind, we'll be focusing back in on a few different areas for next week. But again, next weekend's episode is going to center on Cathie Wood and ARK Investments. And then after we get into Cathie Wood, I'm planning a little bit more of a series on Elon Musk debunking and some of the things the muskrats say about how great Elon is. I think there's a lot to unpack there. Oh, there's so much to unpack. So Elon is going to be making an appearance on Skeptic Sunday, most likely for the October 30th, episode. I hope you guys have enjoyed Skeptic Sunday. I'm just really committed to being here for 2 hours, here on the live show, and we'll go from there, unless anybody shows up and we can extend this exciting live stream even further. But hopefully we've been able to cover different areas of Soros's work, particularly looking at market fundamentalism and some of the opportunities that represents through macro investing like Soros has done. Again, I think there's a lot of interesting things once you consider his position on derivatives. Probably tossing out a lot of terms here, but hey, I'm just here to have a good time. And Leo, the Spanish water dog, wishes y'all farewell. Hey, Mr. Stinky Stinky. Hey. And he's going after his toe webbings. I'm just very excited that we get to end this stream same way it normally starts, which is with Leo chewing on his toe webbings. Again, I really appreciate everybody who attended this stream and hope you all have an excellent rest of the day. And as always, massive thank you to the coffee committee for being such an excellent coffee committee. Thanks so much, guys. And as always, stay skeptical, stay awesome.